the vengeful spirit of Old Six Horns, a small village. In this gripping horror story, a young man named Jack returns to his remote village in the countryside to visit his mother for the holidays, only to be engulfed by a dark mystery surrounding the recent death of a neighbor, Mr. Six. As eerie events unfold, Jack begins to suspect something more sinister is at play, especially when strange voices and terrifying apparitions disturb his peaceful nights. Along the way, Jack uncovers shocking secrets about the relationships in the village, leading to a chilling confrontation with a ghostly presence and a horrifying truth about Mr. Six's demise. Emotionally intense and filled with suspense, the story builds to a climactic revelation where Jack learns the devastating consequences of greed, betrayal, and revenge. Part 1. Homecoming. Jack had never been fond of homecomings. There was always something unsettling about returning to his childhood village. The narrow dirt road that wound through thick groves of trees always seemed too quiet, too still. And this time, after a year away, the silence felt heavier, more oppressive. The old bus seat taken groaned as it pulled away, leaving Jack standing alone in the gathering dusk. His breath fogged in the chilly air, and for a moment he considered turning back. He hadn't seen his mother in over a year, and though he missed her, something about this visit made his skin crawl. He slung his worn backpack over his shoulder and began to walk down the familiar path that led to his family's home. The sky above was bruised with the last light of day, casting long, eerie shadows over the landscape. The village had never felt so empty. Jack couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. He quickened his pace, his footsteps crunching loudly against the gravel road. The further he walked, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. There was a heaviness in the air, a tension that made his heart pound. It was a feeling he couldn't explain, like the earth itself was holding its breath. As Jack neared the small wooden bridge that marked the edge of his village, he saw her. His mother waiting on the other side, just as she had done when he was a child returning from school. Her frail figure was illuminated by the faint glow of a nearby lantern, casting her in a soft, nostalgic light. She was exactly how he remembered, thin, her silver hair tied back under a worn shawl, her face etched with the lines of time. "Jack," she called out, her voice as warm as ever, though it seemed to be carried on the wind, distant and faint. "You're finally home." Jack smiled, waving back at her. His mother's presence brought some relief, and he broke into a slow jog, eager to close the distance. Yet, even as he approached, something gnawed at the back of his mind. The wind had picked up, swirling dead leaves around his feet, but his mother stood unnaturally still. She didn't move from her spot, her eyes locked on him, her smile unchanged, almost too perfect, too still. As he reached the bridge, Jack slowed, his steps tentative. His mother's gaze never left him, and for the briefest moment he thought he saw a shadow flit behind her, quick, dark, and unnatural. He blinked, but it was gone, and his mother's smile remained unbroken. "Mom," Jack called softly, his voice wavering slightly. "I've missed you," her smile faltered. "Just for a second. I've been waiting for you," she said, her voice lowering, almost as if she was saying something she shouldn't. Her eyes flickered to the side, and Jack felt a cold chill run down his spine. She was hiding something, he could feel it. The wind howled through the trees, and Jack found himself shivering. He hadn't remembered the village being this cold, this desolate. His mother reached out, her thin, bony fingers closing around his wrist. Her grip was firmer than he expected, almost uncomfortably tight. "Come on, Jack. Let's go home," she said, her voice now sounding strained, as though something heavy weighed on her. Jack nodded, letting her lead him across the old bridge and down the dirt path toward their house. The walk felt longer than usual, the path more unfamiliar, and the darkness deeper than it should have been. The further they went, the more the village seemed to recede into a cold, lifeless shell of its former self. The house appeared ahead, looking the same as always, small, worn, and humble. Yet tonight it felt like something else entirely. The windows were dark, reflecting the cold, starless sky. The trees around the property swayed ominously, their branches scratching against the roof like skeletal fingers. His mother let go of his wrist as they reached the front door, and Jack flexed his fingers, trying to shake off the lingering numbness from her icy touch. "Go inside, Jack. It's cold," she whispered, almost as if urging him to hurry. Her eyes darted nervously toward the shadows beyond the house, and Jack's stomach knotted. Why was she so afraid? Jack pushed open the creaky wooden door, stepping into the familiar yet foreboding space of his childhood home. The air inside was stale, as if the house hadn't been lived in for years. It smelled faintly of mildew and something else, something that made his skin prickle. He turned to his mother, who hesitated at the threshold, her face partially obscured by the shadows. "Aren't you coming in?" he asked. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "In a minute. I just need to check something." Before Jack could ask what she meant, she disappeared into the night, leaving him standing alone in the doorway. The silence that followed was deafening. Jack stood there, unsure what to do. He glanced around the dim-lit room. Nothing had changed: the same old furniture, the familiar robe, the pictures on the wall, but everything felt wrong, like it was just a memory of home rather than the real thing. His pulse quickened, and the unease he had felt since his arrival began to swell into something darker, something closer to fear. The wind outside picked up again, causing the windows to rattle violently. Jack swallowed hard, feeling a growing sense of dread. Why did the house feel so empty? Where had his mother gone? He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He was being ridiculous, letting his imagination run wild. This was home. This was his mother's house. But no matter how hard he tried to convince himself, the air remained thick with unease. He walked over to the small table in the corner, his fingers tracing the edge of the wood. Dust. The table was covered in a fine layer of dust, as if it hadn't been touched in months. Jack frowned. His mother was meticulous. She would never let the house fall into this state. As he turned toward the fireplace, something caught his eye. A shadow there, just outside the window. It moved quickly, darting past the glass, and Jack's heart nearly stopped. He rushed to the window, peering out into the darkness. Nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind, their branches creaking like old bones. Jack backed away from the window, his breathing shallow. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. He glanced toward the door, expecting to see his mother, but she wasn't there. Panic began to set in. He was alone, completely, utterly alone. Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting the room in a momentary darkness before the dim bulbs sputtered back to life. Jack's pulse raced. The power had never been reliable in the village, but this felt different, like the house itself was alive, its very walls breathing with some unseen force. Jack turned toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms, the narrow space cloaked in shadow. He hadn't been in this house for a year, but he knew every inch of it. Yet tonight, the hallway seemed longer, darker, as though it stretched into an abyss he couldn't see. "Mom," he called out, his voice trembling. No answer. The silence was suffocating. Jack took a step forward, his feet heavy against the creaky wooden floor. As he moved deeper into the house, the temperature dropped sharply, and he could see his breath fogging in the air. Something was wrong, very wrong. He reached his old bedroom door, the wood warped with age. Pushing it open, Jack hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob for a moment longer than necessary. The door creaked open, revealing the small, cramped room he had once called his own. It was untouched, just as he had left it all those years ago. But something was off. The bed, the dresser, the shelves, it all looked the same, yet it felt empty, lifeless. Jack's eyes were drawn to the window, where the pale light of the moon filtered through the curtains. A figure stood outside, its form barely visible through the fog that clung to the glass. Jack's heart stopped. Part 2. A mysterious visitor. The night had fallen quietly over Jack's childhood home, the air outside thick with the eerie stillness that seemed to have settled over the village. The low hum of the wind rattled the windows as he sat at the old wooden table, a soft glow from the oil lamp flickering across the worn-out kitchen. Jack's mother busied herself over the stove, her movements slow and deliberate, filling the room with the familiar scent of simmering broth. It was supposed to be a comforting scene, but something was wrong. Jack couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had followed him since he arrived. It clung to him like a shadow, making the warmth of the kitchen seem false hollow. He watched his mother move, her frail figure bent slightly as she stirred the pot, her back turned to him. "Dinner's almost ready," Jack, she said, her voice soft but strained. "It's been too long since we sat down like this." He tried to smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, I've missed this," he said, though the words felt insincere, distant. The truth was, the house didn't feel like home anymore. There was something about it, about the village, that had changed. He couldn't explain it, but the air seemed thick with something unseen, something dark. As he leaned back in his chair, the wooden legs creaking beneath him, Jack's eyes wandered to the window. The glass was fogged over from the warmth inside, but through the haze he thought he saw a figure standing at the edge of the yard. He blinked, leaning forward, but the figure was gone, swallowed by the mist that clung to the ground. His heart skipped a beat, but he quickly shook off the unease. It was probably just his imagination. After all, the village had always had an eerie air to it, especially at night. The silence, the isolation, it played tricks on the mind. His mother turned from the stove, setting a bowl of steaming broth in front of him. "Eat up, dear," she said, sitting down across from him, her tired eyes searching his face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Jack forced a chuckle, but the sound was hollow. He picked up his spoon, dipping it into the broth, but the food felt heavy on his tongue. His appetite had vanished the moment he'd stepped into the village. There was something wrong here, something lurking just beneath the surface, and it gnawed at him, filling him with an inexplicable sense of dread. The two of them ate in silence, the clink of their spoons the only sound cutting through the oppressive quiet. Jack could feel his mother watching him, but he couldn't bring himself to meet her gaze. He didn't want her to see the fear that was building inside him, the questions that were bubbling up to the surface. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. The sound was soft, almost hesitant, but in the stillness of the house, it echoed like a gunshot. Jack froze, his spoon hovering over his bowl, his breath caught in his throat. "Who could that be at this hour?" his mother whispered, her voice trembling slightly. She stood up slowly, her hand gripping the back of her chair for support. Jack set his spoon down, his pulse quickening. "I'll get it," he said, his voice low, uncertain. As he rose from his chair, the uneasy feeling returned, stronger than before. He moved toward the door, each step heavy with a sense of foreboding. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Jack hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the door handle. His heart was pounding in his chest, the thud of it echoing in his ears. He took a deep breath, bracing himself, and pulled the door open. Standing on the doorstep, shrouded in the misty darkness, was a man. He was tall and gaunt, his shoulders hunched forward, as if weighed down by some invisible burden. His clothes were old and tattered, hanging loosely from his skeletal frame, and his face was pale, almost grey, with deep lines etched into his skin. His eyes, hollow and bloodshot, stared at Jack with an unsettling intensity. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He knew this man. "Mr. Six," he whispered, barely able to get the words out. Mr. Six had been a neighbor when Jack was growing up, an old man who lived alone at the edge of the village. Jack hadn't seen him in years, and yet here he was, standing on his mother's doorstep, looking like he had just crawled out of a grave. "Jack," Mr. Six rasped, his voice dry and brittle, like dead leaves crumbling underfoot. "You've come back." Jack stared at him, speechless, his mind racing. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Mr. Six didn't look well. His skin was too pale, too thin, as if it was stretched tightly over his bones. His eyes were dull, lifeless, and yet they seemed to bore into Jack, searching for something. I didn't know you were still around," Jack said, his voice shaky. "It's been a long time." Mr. Six didn't respond. He just stood there, swaying slightly, his bony hands gripping the doorframe, as if to steady himself. The mist swirled around his feet, curling up his legs like smoke. Jack felt a cold chill creep up his spine. but he stepped aside, motioning for the old man to come in. "Please come inside. It's freezing out there." Mr. Six hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering toward Jack's mother, who was now standing in the kitchen doorway, her face pale and drawn. She said nothing, but Jack could see the fear in her eyes, the way her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the counter. Slowly, Mr. Six stepped over the threshold, his movements stiff and unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. Jack closed the door behind him, shutting out the cold, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop anyway. The old man stood in the center of the room, his eyes scanning the space, as if he was seeing it for the first time. His presence filled the room with an unbearable tension, the air thick with something dark, something unnatural. Jack swallowed hard, trying to push down the growing sense of dread that had taken hold of him. "Please, sit down," he said, gesturing to the empty chair at the table. Mr. Six didn't move. He just stood there staring at Jack, his lips parting slightly as if he were about to speak. But no words came out. Instead, a low, rasping breath escaped his throat, a sound that sent a shiver down Jack's spine. "What brings you here, Mr. Six?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. For a long moment, Mr. Six said nothing. Then finally he spoke, his voice barely audible, like a whisper carried on the wind. "I've been waiting," he said, his eyes locking onto Jack's with an intensity that made his blood run cold. "Waiting for you to come back." Jack's heart pounded in his chest, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. Mr. Six's lips curled into a thin, crooked smile, but it was devoid of any warmth. "There are things you don't know, Jack," he said, his voice so quiet that Jack had to strain to hear him. "Things that have been hidden. But now that you're here, now that you come back, it's time." Jack's blood ran cold. "Time for what?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Six's smile faded, and for a moment, his expression became something darker, something twisted. "You see," he whispered, his voice so soft it was almost lost in the crackling of the fire. Without another word, Mr. Six turned and walked out of the room, disappearing into the shadows beyond the kitchen door. Jack stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, unable to move, unable to speak. He could still feel the cold air that had followed the old man into the house, seeping into his bones, chilling him to the core. Jack turned to his mother, his voice barely above a whisper. What did he mean? His mother didn't answer. She just stared at the empty doorway, her face pale, her hands trembling. Something terrible was coming, and Jack knew that whatever it was, it had already begun. Part 3. The Ghostly Encounter. Jack had tried to settle into the routine of his old life, hoping that the strange feeling that had gripped him since arriving would fade with time. The days were quiet, almost too quiet. There were moments when the stillness seemed oppressive, like the village itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But Jack kept himself busy, helping his mother with small tasks around the house, wandering the overgrown fields, and trying to find solace in the familiar. For a few days, things seemed normal enough. Jack began to think that maybe he had overreacted, maybe the eerie tension was just his imagination playing tricks on him. His mother had always been superstitious, and living in such an isolated place, it wasn't hard to see how stories of ghosts and strange happenings could take root in someone's mind. But still, there was something unsettling that he couldn't quite shake off. It was on the third night that the quiet began to break. The wind had picked up just after sunset, howling through the trees outside and making the old house creak like an old ship at sea. Jack sat by the fire, trying to read, but the flickering shadows on the walls distracted him, moving like dark figures just beyond his vision. Every now and then, he glanced toward the window, expecting to see something or someone looking back at him from the darkness. His mother had gone to bed early, her fragile health keeping her from staying up as late as she used to. The house felt empty without her moving about, the quiet deepening into a suffocating silence. As the fire crackled softly, Jack's eyes grew heavy. The warmth of the flames lulled him into a light doze, the book slipping from his hands. He wasn't sure how long he'd been asleep when something woke him. A sound, faint but distinct, rising above the noise of the wind outside. A whisper. Jack. His name, carried on the cold breeze that slipped through the cracks in the walls, was almost inaudible, but it sent a chill down his spine. Jack's eyes snapped open and he sat up straight, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced around the room, the firelight casting long, flickering shadows across the furniture. The wind howled outside, but the house was still too still. Jack, the whisper came again, louder this time, more insistent. Jack froze, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't possible. He was alone in the room. His mother was asleep upstairs, and the house was locked up tight. He stood slowly, his muscles tense, and moved toward the window, his feet barely making a sound on the creaky wooden floor. Outside, the yard was swallowed by the thick fog that had rolled in off the fields, blanketing everything in a heavy, suffocating mist. He couldn't see anything beyond the faint outline of the trees, their branches swaying like skeletal arms in the wind. Jack. The voice whispered again, closer this time, just outside the window. Jack's heart raced, and he pressed his hand against the glass, squinting into the fog. His breath fogged the window, and for a moment he saw nothing but the shifting mist. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a figure, standing just beyond the reach of the house, its outline barely visible through the swirling fog. Jack's blood ran cold. The figure didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe, but it stood there, watching him. Its shape was distorted by the mist, but Jack could make out the contours of a man tall, thin, hunched slightly forward, as if weighed down by something unseen. For a moment Jack's mind went blank, unable to process what he was seeing. But then the figure moved, its head tilting ever so slightly, and Jack knew. It was Mr. Six. No, Jack whispered, stepping back from the window, his pulse thundering in his ears. That's not possible. He had seen Mr. Six only a few nights ago, standing on his mother's doorstep, pale and frail but alive. He had spoken to him, invited him into their home. And yet, as he stared out into the fog, Jack knew with a sickening certainty that something was horribly wrong. The figure didn't move again. It just stood there, shrouded in mist, watching him with an intensity that made Jack's skin crawl. He wanted to look away, to turn and run, but he couldn't tear his gaze from the window. It was as if the figure was holding him there, trapping him in that moment, forcing him to confront the impossible. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, swallowed by the fog. Jack stumbled back, his legs shaking, and collapsed into the nearest chair. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. It couldn't be real. Mr. Six couldn't be dead. He had seen him with his own eyes, spoken to him. And yet, the way the figure had moved, the way it had stood so still in the fog, watching him with those empty eyes, Jack knew it wasn't the living man he had spoken to. It was something else, something worse. For a long time Jack sat in silence, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his mind spinning with fear and confusion. The fire crackled softly beside him, but the warmth it offered felt distant, cold. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt alien, hostile. He needed to talk to his mother. Jack stood on unsteady legs, his body heavy with dread, and made his way upstairs to her bedroom. The old floorboards creaked under his feet, each step sending a jolt of anxiety through him. He felt like a child again, creeping down the hall after a nightmare, seeking comfort from the one person who had always made him feel safe. He knocked softly on the door, his hand trembling. "Mom," there was no answer. "Mom, are you awake?" he called again, his voice barely above a whisper. Still nothing. Jack pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking, as the room was bathed in the pale light of the moon filtering through the curtains. His mother lay in bed, her frail form barely a lump under the heavy blankets. For a moment, Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him. She was here. She was safe. But then she stirred. Jack, her voice was weak, barely more than a whisper. "What's wrong?" Jack stepped into the room, his heart still racing. "Mom, I saw something outside." She didn't respond right away. Her thin hand reached up, brushing her silver hair from her face as she blinked slowly, trying to focus. "What do you mean, dear?" Jack hesitated, unsure of how to explain what he had seen. I think I saw Mr. Six's mother froze, her eyes wide with sudden shock. "What did you just say?" Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I saw him outside, standing in the fog. He was just watching me." For a long moment, his mother said nothing, her face pale and drawn in the moonlight. Then, slowly, she sat up in bed, her hands trembling. "Jack," she said, her voice low and strained. "That's not possible." Jack's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? His mother looked at him, her eyes filled with a fear he had never seen in her before. "Mr. Six is dead." Jack, the room seemed to spin around him, his mind struggling to process what she had just said. No, that can't be right. I just saw him a few nights ago. He was here, in this house." His mother shook her head, her voice trembling. "He died a few days ago, Jack. They found him in his home, cold and lifeless." Jack felt the ground shift beneath him, his knees weakening. "But I spoke to him. I let him in." Tears well up in his mother's eyes as she reached for his hand. "You couldn't have. Mr. Six has been dead for days." Jack stumbled back, his mind reeling. He had seen Mr. Six, spoken to him, invited him into their home. But now, standing in his mother's room, the truth began to settle in his chest like a lead weight. The man he had seen wasn't Mr. Six, at least not anymore. Jack collapsed into the chair by the window, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His mother watched him, her face pale, her hands trembling in her lap. "Jack," she said softly, "you need to understand. This village, it's not like other places. There are things here, things that you can't explain." Jack looked up at her, his chest tight with fear. "What do you mean?" His mother's eyes flickered to the window, to the fog that still clung to the house like a shroud. "Sometimes," she whispered, "the dead don't stay dead." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking into the air like a stone dropped into deep water. Jack's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but the pieces didn't fit, nothing made sense. And yet, deep down, Jack knew that what his mother was saying was true. He had felt it in the air since he'd arrived, that sense of something unseen, something watching. The village was different now, and whatever had changed, it wasn't finished with him yet. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and Jack shivered. Something was coming, something dark and terrible, and he wasn't sure he was ready to face it. But one thing was certain: the ghost of Mr. Six wasn't the only thing haunting this village. And whatever it was, it had set its sights on Jack. Part 4. Investigation begins. The night after his mother's shocking revelation weighed heavily on Jack. Mr. Six was dead. His mind was in turmoil, and no matter how hard he tried to make sense of what had happened, the puzzle pieces didn't fit. He couldn't reconcile the man he had seen, standing at their doorstep, with the cold, pale corpse his mother insisted had been found days earlier. Restlessness gnawed at Jack. The house felt oppressive, every creak of the old floorboards, every gust of wind outside seemed to whisper secrets, mocking his confusion. The warmth of the fireplace no longer offered comfort, and Jack's skin prickled with the constant sense of being watched. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just in his head. The only thing that could bring him any peace now was to find answers. He had to see the place where Mr. Six had been found, where the old man's life had ended in such a gruesome final act. Jack needed to confront the reality of Mr. Six's death, no matter how dark or twisted it turned out to be. As dawn's faint light crept over the horizon, Jack made his decision. He would go to the field where Mr. Six's body had been discovered. Maybe there, among the trees, the cold earth, and the silence, he could find the answers he so desperately sought. The field where Mr. Six had lived in quiet isolation was a little more than a mile away from Jack's house, perched on the edge of the village where the land dipped into an eerie, mist-filled valley. Jack had always found the area unsettling as a child. The trees there seemed taller, darker, with gnarled branches that clawed at the sky like desperate hands. The valley itself was shrouded in a near-permanent fog, even on the clearest days, making the air heavy with dampness. Jack had heard rumors about that part of the village all his life, stories about things seen in the fog, about strange sounds that could be heard late at night. As he approached the outskirts of Mr. Six's property, those old superstitions came flooding back, creeping up the back of his neck like an icy hand. The wind was cold that morning, biting into Jack's skin as he trudged along the narrow dirt path that led to Mr. Six's cottage. The sun hung low in the sky, veiled by thick clouds, casting the landscape in a dull, grey light. Everything around him seemed muted, distant, like the world had been drained of life. The house came into view, a small, dilapidated shack at the edge of the field. It was even more rundown than Jack remembered, its roof sagging, the windows cracked and covered in grime. Beyond it, a cluster of twisted trees marked the spot where Mr. Six had been found hanging from a makeshift noose. As Jack neared the house, the air grew colder. His breath came out in thick clouds, the fog swirling around his feet as if the ground itself was alive, shifting beneath him. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes drawn to the trees in the distance, and the uneasy sensation that had been nagging at him since his arrival grew stronger. There was something wrong with this place, something deeply unnatural. Jack crossed the threshold into Mr. Six's yard, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced toward the trees where Mr. Six's body had been discovered, the jack branches reaching skyward like skeletal arms. The closer he got, the more suffocating the atmosphere became. It was as if the land itself was rejecting him, pushing him away. But he pressed on, determined to find some kind of closure. The trees stood in a tight cluster at the far end of the property, their branches thick and intertwined, blocking out most of the light. As Jack approached, the shadows deepened, and the air became so thick with mist that he could hardly see a few feet in front of him. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves filled his nostrils, and he wrinkled his nose in disgust. When he reached the clearing beneath the trees, he stopped, staring at the place where Mr. Six had supposedly taken his own life. The ground was uneven here, the roots of the trees sticking out like twisted veins. Jack's eyes scanned the area, searching for any sign of what had happened. And then he saw it. There, near the base of one of the trees, was a dark stain on the ground, fresh blood, glistening wetly in the faint light. Jack's stomach turned as he crouched down, his hand hovering just above the blood. It was still fresh, too fresh for something that was supposed to have happened days ago. A wave of nausea washed over him, and he stood quickly, stepping back from the scene. His mind raced, trying to process what he had just found. If Mr. Six had died days ago, then why was there fresh blood here now? And more importantly, whose blood was it? Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he took a few steps back, his eyes scanning the surrounding trees. The place felt wrong, like the very air was tainted with something dark and twisted. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, that something was watching him from the shadows. Jack, the whisper came again, soft and breathy, like the wind carrying a secret. Jack's blood turned to ice as he froze in place, his body stiff with fear. The voice was coming from behind him. Slowly, Jack turned, his breath catching in his throat. Standing at the edge of the clearing, shrouded in mist, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its form distorted by the fog, but Jack could make out enough to know who it was. Mr. Six. His heart nearly stopped as he stared at the figure, his mind screaming that it couldn't be real. Mr. Six was dead. He had seen the blood, had been told of the man's death by his own mother. And yet, here he was, standing just a few feet away, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and dark. Jack couldn't move. His legs felt like they had turned to lead, his feet rooted to the spot. He tried to speak, to call out, but no sound came from his mouth. He was frozen in place, trapped by the sight of the impossible figure before him. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching Jack with an intensity that made his skin crawl. And then slowly it raised a bony hand, pointing toward the tree where the blood had been found. Jack's heart raced, his mind spinning. He didn't understand. What was Mr. Six trying to tell him? Was it a warning? A threat? Before Jack could react, the figure began to dissolve into the mist, fading away as quickly as it had appeared. Jack was left standing in the clearing, his body trembling, his mind reeling from the encounter. He had to leave. Now. Jack practically ran back to the house, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The image of Mr. 6, standing in the fog, pointing toward the blood, was burned into his mind. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled over him. By the time he reached the house, his hands were shaking so badly that he could barely open the door. He stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind him, as if that simple act could keep the darkness at bay. His mother was waiting for him in the kitchen, her face pale and drawn as she stared at him with wide, fearful eyes. "Jack," she said softly, her voice trembling. What did you find? Jack didn't know how to answer. How could he explain what he had seen, what he had felt? The blood, the figure in the mist, none of it made sense. He felt like he was losing his grip on reality, like the village itself was conspiring against him. I saw him," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. "I saw Mr. 6." His mother's face went white, and she took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's not possible. He's dead, Jack. You know that." "I know what I saw," Jack said, his voice shaking. "He was there in the field." He pointed toward the blood, fresh blood, Mom. "I don't know what's happening, but something's wrong." For a long moment, his mother said nothing. She just stood there, her eyes filled with a fear that mirrored Jack's own. And then, slowly she nodded, as if coming to some grim understanding. "There are things in this village," Jack, she said quietly, her voice low and filled with dread. "Things you don't understand, Mr. 6. He wasn't the first. There are others too. Other deaths, other things." Jack felt the blood drain from his face as her words sank in. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. His mother's eyes flickered toward the window, her face etched with a fear Jack had never seen before. "You're not safe here, Jack," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "None of us are." Jack's stomach twisted with fear as he realized the full weight of what she was saying. Something was wrong with the village, something dark and twisted. And whatever it was, it wasn't finished with him yet. The investigation had only just begun, and Jack feared that the answers he sought would lead him into something far more terrifying than he could ever have imagined. Part 5. Uncovering Secrets. The house had grown quiet again, but the air inside felt thick, almost suffocating. Jack paced back and forth in the small, dim-lit kitchen, his thoughts racing as his mother sat silently at the table, her hands clasped together as though she were in prayer. The encounter in the field had shaken Jack to his core, but the discovery of the fresh blood and the presence of Mr. 6, whether it was his ghost or something far worse, was only part of a deeper mystery that gnawed at him. There had to be more to the story. His mother had been watching him ever since he returned from the field, her eyes filled with a quiet knowing, like she held the key to secrets she was too afraid to share. Jack could feel it. There was something she wasn't telling him, something that could explain what was happening. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, Jack stopped pacing and turned to face her. "Mom," he said, his voice quiet but insistent, "I need to know. You've lived here all your life. You've heard the rumors, the whispers. What aren't you telling me about Mr. 6? His mother flinched, her fingers tightening around the worn tablecloth as she looked away, avoiding his gaze. Jack could see the hesitation in her expression, the fear that had taken root in her eyes since they'd spoken of Mr. 6's death. She knew something. He was sure of it. "Mom," Jack pressed, stepping closer. "Please. I need to understand what's happening." For a long moment, his mother didn't speak. The ticking of the old clock on the wall filled the room, the sound grating on Jack's nerves. He was about to ask again when his mother finally sighed, a deep, tremulous breath, and looked up at him. "There's something you should know, Jack," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something about Mr. 6 and the others." Jack's heart skipped a beat. "Others?" he echoed, frowning. "What do you mean?" His mother glanced toward the window, as if checking to make sure no one was outside listening. The fog outside clung to the glass, obscuring their view of the yard, but Jack could sense her unease. The way her hands trembled slightly, As she continued, "There's been talk in the village for years," she began, her voice wavering. "Rumors about things that have happened, deaths, disappearances. People say this village is cursed, that the land itself is tainted." Jack's skin prickled with unease, but he didn't interrupt. He could sense that there was more, something darker lurking just beneath the surface of her words. "Mr. Six wasn't the first," she went on, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Others have died in strange ways, under strange circumstances, but no one ever talks about it, not openly." They're too afraid. Jack swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. He had heard rumors, as a child whispers of strange happenings, of things that went bump in the night, but he had always dismissed them as nothing more than small-town superstition. Now though, it seemed like there was more truth to those old stories than he had ever realized. "And what about Mr. Six?" Jack asked, his voice tight. "What happened to him?" His mother hesitated, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "There were rumors," she said softly, "about a feud he had with Mr. T." Jack frowned. "Mr. T?" "The man who owns the land next to Mr. Six's property." She nodded slowly. "Yes, they had a falling out years ago over the land. Mr. Six claimed that Mr. T had encroached on his property, but no one ever believed him. Mr. T is well liked in the village, and most people sided with him. After that, things got worse between them. They barely spoke, but when they did, it was always with harsh words." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. He remembered Mr. T, a gruff man with a booming voice and a reputation for being stubborn, almost territorial. As a child, Jack had always found him intimidating, but he never thought of him as dangerous. But now, with the tension between him and Mr. Six resurfacing in Jack's mind, things began to look different. "Do you think he could have been involved in Mr. Six's death?" Jack asked, the words heavy with implication. His mother didn't answer right away. She pressed her lips together, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know," she admitted softly, "but I do know this Mr. T has always been the kind of man who gets what he wants, no matter the cost." Jack's stomach twisted with unease. Could Mr. T have been responsible for Mr. Six's death? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. If there had been bad blood between the two men, it was possible, but how could he prove it? And what if Mr. T was capable of more than just petty grievances over land? "I need to find out the truth," Jack said, more to himself than to his mother. "Something's not right here, and I can't just let it go." His mother looked at him, her expression a mix of fear and resignation. "Be careful, Jack," she said quietly. "This place, it's not like anywhere else. The people here, some of them are hiding things, dark things." Jack nodded, his resolve hardening. He couldn't just walk away from this. Whatever had happened to Mr. Six, whatever was happening in the village, it was tied to something much deeper, something older. And he was determined to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. The next day, Jack set out toward Mr. T's property. His stomach churned with anxiety as he walked, his mind racing with questions. He didn't know what he would find, or if Mr. T would even be willing to talk to him. But he had to try. The thought of Mr. Six's blood, still fresh on the ground near the tree, haunted him. It was a puzzle piece that didn't fit, and Jack needed answers. As he approached Mr. S's farmhouse, the air seemed to grow colder, the wind biting at his skin, despite the weak sunlight filtering through the clouds. The house stood at the top of a small hill, its windows dark and unwelcoming. Jack's footsteps crunched on the gravel driveway as he made his way to the front door, his heart pounding in his chest. He knocked, the sound echoing through the stillness of the morning. For a long moment, there was no response, and Jack wondered if Mr. T was even home. But just as he was about to knock again, the door creaked open, revealing the man himself. Mr. T was older than Jack remembered, his face lined with deep wrinkles and his eyes sharp, almost hawk-like. He stood in the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest, staring down at Jack with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. "Jack," Mr. T said, his voice gruff. "What brings you here?" Jack swallowed hard, his palms suddenly sweaty. "I wanted to ask you about Mr. Six." At the mention of the name, Mr. T's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. What about him? Jack hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. He could feel the weight of Mr. T's gaze on him, and for a moment he wondered if coming here had been a mistake. But he couldn't back down now. He had to know the truth. There are rumors, Jack said slowly, about what happened to him. About his death. Mr. T's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening. What are you getting at, boy? Jack held his ground, even though his heart was racing. People say you and Mr. Six had a falling out. That there was bad blood between you. For a moment, Mr. T didn't say anything. He just stared at Jack, his face unreadable. The silence stretched on, thick with tension, until finally Mr. T let out a low chuckle, though there was no humor in it. That old fool, he muttered, shaking his head. He never did know when to let things go. Jack frowned. What do you mean? Mr. T sighed, rubbing a hand over his wetted face. Look, Jack, I didn't kill him if that's what you're implying. The man was troubled, always thought people were out to get him. Claimed I was stealing his land, but it was nonsense. We argued, sure, but I didn't have anything to do with his death. Jack wanted to believe him, but something about Mr. Tone, something about the way he had dismissed Mr. Six so easily felt off. There was a coldness to it, a lack of empathy that sent a chill down Jack's spine. Then how do you explain the blood? Jack asked, his voice steady despite the nervousness gnawing at him. I found fresh blood near the tree where they said he hung himself. It doesn't add up. Mr. T's expression hardened, and for a moment Jack thought he saw a flicker of something darker in the man's eyes, something almost predatory. You're playing with fire, Jack, Mr. T said quietly, his voice low and dangerous. I suggest you let this go. Some things are better left buried. Jack's pulse quickened, but he didn't back down. I'm not letting it go, he said, his voice firm. Mr. Six didn't kill himself. I don't know what's going on, but I'm going to find out. For a long moment, they stood there, locked in a silent standoff. Jack could feel the weight of Mr. T's, the threat behind his words, but he wouldn't be intimidated. Not now, not when he was so close to the truth. Do what you want, Mr. T finally said, his voice cold. But don't come crying to me when you find something you wish you hadn't. He turned and slammed the door in Jack's face, leaving him standing alone on the porch, his heart pounding in his chest. Jack walked away from the farmhouse, his mind racing. Mr. T's warning echoed in his ears, but it only fueled his determination. There was something sinister lurking in this village, something tied to Mr. Six's death and possibly to others before him. Jack knew he was getting closer to the truth, but the deeper he dug, the more dangerous it became. And he had the sinking feeling that whatever secrets this village was hiding, they wouldn't stay buried for long. As he made his way back toward the house, the fog began to roll in again, thick and suffocating, swallowing the landscape in its cold embrace. The wind whispered through the trees, and Jack shivered as a sense of dread settled over him. The truth was out there waiting for him, but it wouldn't be uncovered without a fight. Part 6. Confrontation at the field. The air hung heavy that night, thick with the damp chill of the fog that blanketed the village. Jack stood at the window, staring out into the mist-laden darkness, his thoughts racing. The confrontation with Mr. T lingered in his mind, a web of confusion and suspicion tightening around him. Something was deeply wrong with the story Mr. T had told him. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that there were still missing pieces that only the field, the cursed place where Mr. Six had died, could reveal. He had returned to the field once before, after learning of Mr. Six's death, and the eerie presence of the old man's ghost had rattled him to the core. But now, with the knowledge that Mr. T had been involved, driven by greed, hunger for land, Jack knew he had to go back. There were answers buried beneath the earth, and Jack needed to unearth them. The wind howled outside, brushing the fog against the window like ghostly fingers. Jack took a deep breath, grabbed his jacket, and steeled himself for the night ahead. He knew what he had to do. The path to the field was darker than usual, the fog swallowing what little light the moon provided. The crunch of gravel beneath Jack's boots seemed too loud in the silence. like the sound was bouncing back at him, mocking him. As he approached the edge of the field, he felt the familiar shiver of dread crawl down his spine. The twisted trees loomed ahead like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal arms, waiting to pull him into their depths. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he neared the tree where Mr. Six had been found. The air seemed to grow colder the closer he got, a chill that seeped into his bones, making the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. The tree itself looked more ominous than before, its dark bark slick with moisture, and the rope that had once held Mr. Six's body now swayed gently in the breeze. As Jack stepped into the clearing, he stopped short. His breath caught in his throat. A shadowy figure stood near the tree, shrouded in the mist. At first Jack thought it might be Mr. Six's ghost again, come to haunt him once more. But then the figure shifted, stepping into the faint light of the moon, and Jack's stomach twisted with recognition. It was Mr. T. The old man was standing with his back to Jack, his head bowed as though in prayer. But Jack could see his hands shaking, clutching something tightly, a bundle of papers, perhaps, or something more sinister. The fog curled around him like a living thing, as if it were trying to swallow him whole. Jack felt a surge of anger rise up in his chest. He had come here for answers, but it seemed Mr. T had beaten him to it. Whatever he was doing, it couldn't be good. Jack clenched his fists, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what he was going to do, but he knew he couldn't let Mr. T leave without a confrontation. Mr. T. Jack's voice cut through the silence, sharp and accusing. Mr. T flinched, his shoulders stiffening as he slowly turned to face Jack. His eyes, wild and bloodshot, locked onto Jack's with a mixture of fear and defiance. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the tension between them crackling like static electricity. "You're here," Mr. T finally muttered, his voice hoarse and shaky. "I didn't think you'd come." Jack narrowed his eyes, stepping closer. "Why are you here, Mr. T? What are you doing?" The old man's gaze flickered to the tree behind him, and for a brief second, Jack thought he saw a glimmer of guilt flash across his face. But it was gone just as quickly, replaced by a look of desperation. "I came to make things right," Mr. T said, his voice low. "But it's too late for that now." Jack's stomach churned with unease. "Too late for what? What are you talking about?" Mr. T shook his head, his hand still trembling as he clutched the papers tightly to his chest. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he whispered, his voice breaking. "It wasn't supposed to end this way." Jack's pulse quickened, his heart pounding in his ears. What wasn't supposed to happen? Mr. Six's death. Mr. T has flicked back to the tree, and Jack followed his gaze, dread coiling in his gut. The rope swayed gently in the breeze, creaking with the weight of the memories it held. Jack swallowed hard, the pieces of the puzzle finally beginning to fall into place. "You were there that night, weren't you?" Jack's voice was barely a whisper, but the accusation hung in the air like a death sentence. Mr. T didn't answer immediately. His eyes darted around, as if he were looking for a way out, but there was none. The truth was closing in on him, and there was nowhere left to hide. "I didn't want to kill him, Mr. T finally confessed, his voice trembling with emotion. "I just wanted the land." "That's all I ever wanted." Jack's blood ran cold. "You wanted his land so badly that you were willing to kill him for it." Mr. T shook his head violently, his face contorted with anguish. "No, I didn't mean to. We argued, yes, but it wasn't supposed to go that far. I just wanted him to sign over the land to make things easier for both of us. But he wouldn't listen. He fought back, and before I knew it..." His voice trailed off, leaving the terrible truth hanging in the air between them. Jack's heart raced as the full weight of Mr. T's confession hit him. This wasn't an accident. Mr. Six hadn't taken his own life. He had been murdered by a man driven by greed and desperation, and now his spirit was seeking justice. "You killed him," Jack whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You killed Mr. Six." Mr. T's face crumpled, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I didn't mean to," he sobbed, sinking to his knees in front of the tree. "It was an accident, I swear. I just wanted the land. I just wanted the land." Jack's mind reeled with the enormity of what he had just learned. The ground seemed to shift beneath him, as if the earth itself were rejecting the weight of the truth. He had come here seeking answers, and now that he had them, he wasn't sure what to do. Mr. T knelt in the shadow of the tree, his body racked with sobs, but Jack felt no pity for him. The old man's greed had cost Mr. Six his life, and now his spirit would never rest until justice was served. Jack could feel it in the air, the thick, oppressive weight of unfinished business hanging over the clearing like a storm, waiting to break. "You need to go," Jack said quietly, his voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside him. "You need to leave this place." Mr. T looked up at him, his eyes wide with fear. "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice trembling. Jack didn't answer immediately. He wasn't sure himself what he was going to do, but he knew one thing for certain: Mr. Six's death wasn't over. His spirit was still here, trapped in this place, waiting for justice. "I don't know," Jack admitted, his voice soft but resolute. "But I won't let you get away with this." Mr. T's face bowed, and he scrambled to his feet, backing away from Jack, as though he were facing a vengeful spirit himself. "You don't understand," he stammered, his voice rising in panic. "There's more to this than you know. It wasn't just about the land, it was about survival." Jack's brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about?" Mr. T's eyes darted around the clearing, as if he were searching for something unseen. "There are things in this village," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Things that you can't even begin to understand. Mr. Six, he was just a beginning." Jack's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Mr. T shook his head, his eyes wide with terror. "You'll see," he muttered, backing away. "You'll see soon enough." Before Jack could ask him anything else, Mr. T turned and fled, disappearing into the fog that swirled around the clearing like a living thing. Jack stood frozen, his heart racing as the weight of the truth settled over him. Mr. Six's death had been no accident. His spirit was still here, still watching, still waiting. But there was something more, something darker, lurking beneath the surface of the village. And Jack was beginning to realize that he was in far more danger than he had ever imagined. Jack stayed in the clearing long after Mr. T had fled, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. The fog thickened, curling around the trees and seeping into the earth, and Jack felt a coldness deep in his bones that went beyond the chill of the night air. It was the cold of something ancient and restless, something that had been disturbed and wouldn't be satisfied until its thirst for justice was quenched. As Jack stood there, staring at the tree where Mr. Six had died, he felt the presence again, a cold, ghostly presence that seemed to wrap itself around him, suffocating him with its silent demand. He could almost hear it, a whisper on the wind, calling for justice, for retribution. Mr. Six wasn't done, not yet. Jack took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. He had come to this village seeking answers, and now he had them. But the cost was far higher than he had ever anticipated. He wasn't just dealing with the death of one man, he was dealing with something far older, far more dangerous, something that had been lurking in the shadows of this village for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. And Jack had a feeling that moment was coming soon. Very soon. Part 7, The Ghost Plea. The night had never seemed so dark. As Jack stood in the eerie silence of the field, the wind began to howl, picking up speed, carrying with it a haunting whisper. The air was thick, charged with something far beyond the natural world, something that clawed at the edges of Jack's sanity, pulling him deeper into the darkness. His breath came in ragged gasps as he felt the presence return, the weight of Mr. Six's death pressing down on him like a physical force. The conversation with Mr. T still rang in Jack's ears, every word laced with guilt and fear. He hadn't meant to kill Mr. Six, he said. But Jack knew better. Greed had driven the old man to the brink, and now it had left a spirit bound to this earth, seeking the justice that had been denied him in life. Jack's hands shook as he clutched the collar of his jacket, trying to ward off the cold that seemed to seep into his bones. His eyes scanned the dark field, the skeletal trees swaying in the wind, their twisted branches like accusing fingers pointing toward the truth. The moon, once a pale beacon of light, was now obscured by thick clouds, casting everything in a deep, impenetrable shadow. And then, just as the wind howled through the branches, Jack heard it. "Help me," the voice was faint, barely more than a breath, but it sent a jolt of electricity through Jack's body. His heart pounded in his chest, his throat tightening as he struggled to comprehend what he had just heard. "Please, help me." Jack's blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakable. It was Mr. Six. His legs trembled, but Jack forced himself to take a step forward, his eyes searching the darkness for the source of the voice. The wind whipped at his face, stinging his eyes, but he didn't dare blink. Every sense was on high alert, every nerve tingling with the knowledge that he wasn't alone. Mr. Six Jack's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried in the stillness of the night. The wind seemed to shift, swirling around him like an invisible force, and for a moment Jack thought he saw something, a shadow, a flicker of movement just beyond the tree where Mr. Six had died. His heart leapt into his throat, and he took another step closer, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. "Please," the voice came again, more insistent this time, and Jack's heart clenched at the desperation in it. "I need your help." Jack swallowed hard, his mouth dry, as he moved closer to the tree. The rope that had once held Mr. Six's lifeless body still swayed gently in the wind, creaking softly as if it too was haunted by the memory of that terrible night. Jack's skin prickled with fear, but he couldn't turn back now. Someone was calling to him, begging for his help. He reached the base of the tree, the rough bark cold beneath his fingertips. His breath misted in the air as he stared up at the twisted branches, half expecting to see Mr. Six's ghost hanging there, his face pale and hollow, his eyes filled with the torment of the afterlife. But there was nothing, only the rope, swaying in the wind, and the soft rustle of the leaves overhead. Jack closed his eyes, listening intently. The wind had quieted now, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting. And then, from somewhere deep within the shadows, the voice came again. "Jack." This time, it was louder. Closer. Jack's eyes flew open, his pulse quickening as he turned in the direction of the voice. His heart pounded in his chest, his body frozen with a mix of fear and anticipation. The air seemed to thicken around him, pressing in from all sides, and for a moment Jack felt as though he couldn't breathe. "Jack, you have to help me," the voice pleaded, and Jack's chest tightened with the weight of the words. There was so much pain in that voice, so much anguish, and Jack knew, without a doubt, that this was no mere hallucination. This was real. Mr. Six was here, trapped between worlds, begging for help. "What do you want?" Jack whispered, his voice trembling. "What do you need me to do?" For a moment, there was silence. The wind died down, the air still as death itself. Jack's heart raced, every muscle in his body tense as he waited for the answer. And then, with a sudden gust of wind that nearly knocked Jack off his feet, the voice returned, this time louder, clearer, filled with desperation. "The truth," it whispered, the words like ice on Jack's skin. "I need the truth." Jack's breath hitched in his throat as the full weight of those words settled over him. The truth, that was what Mr. Six had been denied in life, and now, even in death, he was still searching for it. He needed justice, he needed the world to know what had really happened. Jack's mind raced. The truth. The truth about what? About his death? About Mr. Tay's involvement? Or was there something deeper, something darker lurking beneath the surface? "Please," Mr. Six's voice came again, softer now, almost pleading. "I can't rest. Not until the truth is revealed." Jack's heart clenched with a mixture of fear and determination. He couldn't ignore this. He couldn't walk away from the man who was calling out to him, begging for help. Mr. Six had been wrong, killed, perhaps even murdered, and now his spirit was trapped, caught between this world and the next, unable to move on until justice was served. Jack swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had to do something. He had to help. But how? He closed his eyes, trying to steady his racing thoughts. There had to be a way to uncover the truth. Mr. T had already admitted that he didn't mean to kill Mr. Six, but Jack knew there was more to the story. Something Mr. T was hiding, something that had been kept secret for far too long. As the wind swirled around him, Jack made a decision. He would confront Mr. T again. This time he wouldn't stop until he had the full story. Mr. Six deserved justice, and Jack wasn't going to rest until he had uncovered the truth. The next morning, Jack stood outside Mr. T's farmhouse, the wind still howling in his ears, the weight of the previous night pressing down on him like a stone. He had barely slept, his mind consumed with thoughts of Mr. Six's ghostly voice, the desperation in his plea for help. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that if he didn't act soon, something terrible would happen. The village had been shrouded in mystery for too long, and Jack had a sinking suspicion that Mr. Six's death was only the tip of the iceberg. Taking a deep breath, Jack knocked on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound echoed through the stillness, but there was no answer. Jack frowned, knocking again, harder this time. "Mr. T." Jack called, his voice carrying through the wind. "I know you're in there. We need to talk for a moment." There was silence. Then, just as Jack was about to knock again, the door creaked open, revealing Mr. T standing in the doorway, his face pale and drawn. "What do you want, Jack?" Mr. T's voice was low, almost hollow, as if he had aged a decade overnight. Jack squared his shoulders, meeting the old man's gaze. "I want the truth." Mr. T's eyes flickered with something fear, perhaps, or guilt, but he didn't respond. Instead, he stepped aside, allowing Jack to enter the house. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp wood and something else, something sour, like rotting fruit. Jack followed Mr. T into the living room, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of what he was hiding. The furniture was old and worn, the walls lined with dusty bookshelves and faded photographs. It was a place that had seen better days, much like its owner. Mr. T sank into a chair by the fireplace, his hands shaking as he poured himself a glass of whiskey. He didn't offer Jack a drink, nor did he seem inclined to make small talk. Instead, he stared into the fire, his eyes glazed over as though he were lost in a memory. "I didn't want this," Mr. T muttered, more to himself than to Jack. "I didn't want any of this." Jack stepped closer, his voice steady but insistent. "Then tell me what happened. The whole truth this time." For a long moment, Mr. T didn't speak. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across his face, but he remained silent, his eyes distant and haunted. Jack could see the guilt weighing on him, the burden of a secret he had carried for far too long. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mr. T spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he said, his hands trembling as he clutched the glass. "I just wanted the land. That's all I ever wanted." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard this before, but there was something different about the way Mr. T said it now, something that made Jack believe he was finally telling the truth. "I thought if I could get him to sign it over, everything would be fine," Mr. T continued, his voice thick with emotion, but he refused. He wouldn't budge. We argued, and then Mr. T's voice trailed off, his eyes filling with tears. Jack's stomach churned with a mixture of anger and pity. He wanted to hate the old man, but he could see now that this wasn't just about greed. There was something deeper, something that had driven Mr. T to this breaking point. "I didn't mean to kill him," Mr. T said, his voice cracking. "But when he fell, when I saw him lying there, I panicked. I thought he was dead." Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he listened to the old man's confession. He had been right all along. Mr. Six's death wasn't an accident. But there was still something missing, something Jack couldn't quite put his finger on. "What happened next?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. T wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, his breath ragged. "I left him there," he said, his voice trembling. "I left him lying at the base of the tree. And when I came back, he was gone." Jack's blood ran cold. Part 8. The Chilling Revelation. The dim light from the fireplace flickered in the small room, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. Jack sat in silence, his mind reeling from Mr. T's latest admission. The old man slumped in his chair, his face ashen, and his eyes haunted by the secrets he had kept buried for so long. The weight of his confession hung in the air like a noose, tightening around them both. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows with its unrelenting force. It was as if the night itself had come alive, demanding to be heard. But the real storm was brewing within Jack. He could feel it now, the truth pressing against the walls of his mind, clawing its way out. The pieces were falling into place, one by one, but the full picture, the brutal reality of what had happened, was still too horrific to fully comprehend. Mr. T's voice, when it came, was a broken rasp. "I never thought it would end like this," he muttered, staring into the flames as if they could offer him some form of absolution. "I thought I could. I thought if I had the land, things would be better, but everything went wrong, so terribly wrong." Jack clenched his fists, the rage simmering beneath the surface of his calm exterior. "You wanted the land so badly that you killed him for it." His voice trembled, not with fear, but with barely contained anger. Mr. T flinched, his body seeming to shrink into the chair, as though he could escape the judgment in Jack's words. "I didn't kill him, not like that. I swear. I just wanted him to sell, to let me have the property. But he wouldn't listen, kept talking about principles and what's right, mister." He spat the words like they were poison. "And one night, we argued. He got out of control. The old man's hands shook, the tremor spreading through his frail body as he spoke." Jack leaned forward, his heart hammering in his chest as the details began to surface. "That night," Mr. T continued, his voice cracking, "I came to his house late, too late. I was drunk and I didn't care about his damn principles anymore. I thought maybe if I scared him he'd give in, so I followed him all the way out to that cursed field." Jack's throat tightened as a memory surfaced, the rope swaying gently from the gnarled tree, the air thick with the stench of death. He knew this field. This was where Mr. Six had died, where his body had been found, swinging in the cold night wind. What happened? Jack pressed, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Mr. T's eyes filled with a terror that made Jack's blood run cold. "We fought, Jack. I didn't mean for it to go that far. I was just trying to scare him, but..." His voice dropped to a tortured whisper. "He fell. He hit his head on the rocks, and I panicked. I thought he was dead." The room seemed to shrink as Jack's heart raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. "What did you do, Mr. T? What did you do after he fell?" Mr. T swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as if the truth itself was choking him. "I tied the rope around his neck and hung him from the tree." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. His stomach churned as the room tilted around him, the weight of Mr. T's confession bearing down on him like a crushing wave. Mr. Six hadn't taken his own life, he had been murdered. And Mr. T had staged it to look like a suicide. Jack's mind raced. It all made sense now, the strange occurrences, the ghostly whispers, the restless spirit that haunted the field. Mr. Six had been crying out for justice, for someone to uncover the truth about his death. And now that Jack knew, the cold, spectral presence that had been lingering on the edges of his consciousness was growing stronger, more insistent. You made it look like a suicide," Jack whispered, his voice thick with disgust. "You let everyone believe he killed himself, while you walked away with the land." Mr. Ty's well with tears, the guilt and horror of what he had done finally consuming him. "I didn't know what else to do," he sobbed. "I couldn't let anyone find out. I thought I could live with it, that it would go away, but it hasn't." He hasn't. The last word sent a shiver down Jack's spine. "What do you mean?" Mr. T's gaze darted around the room, as though expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. His hand shook violently, and his voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. "He's been haunting me, Jack. I see him. I hear him every night. He's everywhere watching, waiting." His eyes widened in terror as the wind outside seemed to howl in agreement. "He won't leave me alone." A cold dread settled over Jack as he realized what Mr. T was saying. Mr. Six's spirit had been seeking revenge, hounding Mr. T night after night, demanding retribution. Jack had heard the voice himself, felt the ghost's presence. But now, as Mr. T spoke, the supernatural force that had been lurking on the fringes of his awareness seemed to press in closer, suffocating him with its intensity. The wind outside grew louder, the rattling of the windows more violent, as though the house itself was about to collapse under the weight of the truth. Jack's skin prickled, a deep sense of unease crawling over him. And then, over the noise of the storm, he heard it again. "Help me," the voice was unmistakable Mr. Six, calling out from beyond the grave. Jack's blood turned to ice as the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, the chill settling deep into his bones. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and he could feel the ghost's presence growing stronger, more demanding. "Please, help me." Jack's hands tightened into fists. He had come too far to turn back now. He couldn't leave Mr. Six's spirit to suffer like this, not after everything he had uncovered. But the fear in Mr. Ty's was real, too. The old man was being tormented, slowly driven mad by the ghost's relentless presence. "What does he want?" Jack asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Mr. T's face crumpled with despair. "He wants justice," he said, his voice cracking. "He wants the truth to come out. But it's too late. I can't give him what he wants. I'm trapped, Jack. Trapped in this hell I created." Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he realized what needed to be done. The ghost of Mr. Six wasn't going to stop until the truth was revealed, until Mr. T confessed his crime and the village knew the terrible reality of what had happened that night. But would that be enough? Would Mr. Six's spirit rest if Mr. T came forward, or was the damage too great to be undone? The wind howled louder, the fire in the hearth flickering violently as the temperature dropped even further. Jack shuddered, his breath misting in the air as the ghost's presence pressed down on him, more oppressive than ever. "I can't do it," Mr. T muttered, rocking back and forth in his chair. "I can't face the truth. I've done too much. He'll never forgive me." Jack swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He could feel Mr. Six's spirit growing more desperate, more insistent, and he knew that time was running out. The ghost was growing stronger, fueled by the injustice of his death, and Jack was certain that if Mr. T didn't confess soon, something terrible would happen, something far worse than a restless spirit haunting the night. "You have to confess," Jack said, his voice firm, despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "It's the only way to stop this. The only way to give Mr. Six peace." Mr. T shook his head violently, his eyes wide with terror. "No, I can't. He'll kill me, Jack. He'll kill me for what I've done." Jack's stomach twisted with a sickening sense of dread. He didn't know what would happen if Mr. T confessed, but he knew one thing for certain: Mr. Six's spirit wouldn't rest until justice had been served. The wind outside reached a fever pitch, the windows rattling so violently that Jack thought they might shatter at any moment. The fire sputtered and hissed, as if being choked by the supernatural force that filled the room. And then, just as the tension reached its breaking point, Jack heard the voice again, louder, clearer, and more desperate than ever. Just as Jack's blood froze as a word echoed through the room, reverberating in his skull like the tolling of a bell. The ghost wasn't asking for help anymore, he was demanding it. With a deep breath, Jack made his decision. "Confess, Mr. T," he said, his voice shaking but resolute. "Confess, or this will never end, Mr." T looked up at him, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow with fear. For a moment, Jack thought he might refuse, that he might continue to cling to the lie that had destroyed so many lives. But then, with a shuddering breath, Mr. T nodded. "I'll do it," he whispered. "I'll confess." Jack nodded, relief washing over him. It wasn't over yet, but they were one step closer to ending the nightmare. As Mr. T slumped back in his chair, defeated, Jack felt the ghost's presence begin to recede, the air in the room lightening ever so slightly. The storm outside still raged, but the oppressive weight that had been pressing down on them was lifting. But as Jack turned to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. There was still something lurking in the shadows waiting, and Jack had a sinking feeling that it was only a matter of time before it revealed itself. Part 9. Justice and Closure. The chill of the night clung to Jack as he stepped out of Mr. Tao's, the truth still heavy on his chest. The sky above was a blanket of oppressive darkness, broken only by the occasional glimmer of stars fighting through the dense clouds. Jack inhaled deeply, the cold air burning his lungs as his heart pounded from the weight of what he had just witnessed. Mr. Tearful's confession echoed in his mind like a relentless drumbeat, reverberating with the finality of truth, but also with the sense of something darker, unfinished. Jack glanced over his shoulder, catching a glimpse of Mr. T through the small window, his figure slumped in the chair by the fire. The old man looked like a hollowed-out shell, drained of everything that had once animated him. Guilt had finally eaten through the fabric of his soul, leaving behind only a wreck of a man consumed by the consequences of his own greed. But even though the confession had been dragged out of Mr. T, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The wind whipped through the trees, a low, mournful howl that seemed to carry a message just for him. Jack's skin prickled as he heard the familiar voice again, whispering on the edge of the breeze, faint but unmistakable. Justice. Mr. Six was still here, still waiting. Jack could feel his presence hovering just beyond the veil of the living world, like a specter that refused to fade. The confession alone hadn't been enough. The truth, though now revealed, was incomplete. It hadn't reached the ears of those who needed to hear it. The people of the village, the ones who had mourned Mr. Six's death, had been deceived for too long. Justice wasn't just about the guilty confessing, it was about the truth being known, about bringing closure not just for the living, but for the dead. As Jack stood in the cold darkness, a deep resolve settled into him. He couldn't leave things as they were. Mr. T-Tilt had to be exposed, not hidden away like some dirty secret. Mr. Six deserved to have his name cleared, to be seen as the victim he truly was, not as a man who had taken his own life, but as one who had been robbed of it. With renewed determination, Jack set off through the village, his steps purposeful and firm despite the biting wind. He could feel the weight of the task ahead, but something else had changed inside him. The fear that had gripped him earlier was gone, replaced by a sense of duty. Mr. Six's voice was no longer the haunting plea of a restless spirit, but a guiding force pushing Jack toward the justice he sought. The village lay quiet under the night's cloak, its inhabitants fast asleep, unaware of the storm of truth about to break over them. Jack's mind raced as he formulated a plan. The village elders, the ones who had believed in Mr. T's lies, who had spoken at Mr. Six's funeral, mourning what they thought was a suicide, had to know. And there was only one way to make sure they listened. He had to confront them publicly. It was well past midnight when Jack arrived at the community hall, the place where the village's most important decisions were made, where grievances were aired, and where the truth could finally come to light. His hands trembled slightly as he grasped the iron handle of the door and pushed it open, the creak of the hinges loud in the empty hall. The vast space echoed with the memories of old meetings, decisions made, and judgments passed. Jack took a deep breath, his heart racing in anticipation of what was to come. He knew the villagers would resist the truth many had admired Mr. T, a respected man in the community, but there was no turning back now. By dawn, the elders and a crowd of villagers had gathered, summoned by Jack's urgent calls. He stood before them, his heart pounding in his chest, as they murmured and whispered among themselves. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the faces of the men and women who had known Mr. Six for decades. "Why have you called us here?" Jack, one of the elders, asked, his voice gruff with impatience. "What's this about?" Jack took a deep breath, his throat dry. He knew this was the moment that would decide everything, not just for him, but for Mr. Six's restless spirit. He felt the weight of that responsibility settle on his shoulders like a heavy cloak, but he stood tall, meeting the eyes of the crowd. "I've uncovered the truth about Mr. Six's death," Jack began, his voice steady despite the rising tension in the room. "It wasn't a suicide. Mr. T was responsible. He murdered Mr. Six to take his land." A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd, disbelief etched on the faces of those who had long trusted Mr. T. The elders exchanged uneasy glances, their brows furrowed in confusion. "Are you accusing Mr. T of murder?" one of the elders demanded, his voice incredulous. "That's a serious claim, Jack. Do you have any proof?" Jack nodded, feeling a surge of conviction. "He confessed it to me last night. He tried to cover it up by making it look like a suicide, but Mr. Six didn't hang himself. He was killed, and his death has haunted this village ever since." The crowd fell silent, the weight of Jack's words sinking in. For a long, tense moment, no one spoke. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of the old hall, as if urging the villagers to listen, to understand. "He confessed?" another elder asked, his voice quieter now, tinged with doubt. "And you believe him?" Jack stepped forward, his eyes blazing with intensity. "I felt Mr. Six's presence. I've heard his voice crying out for justice. He can't rest, not until the truth is known. And I swear to you, Mr. T is the reason he's dead." A cold, tense silence filled the room as the villagers processed the gravity of what Jack had revealed. The elders exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions grim. Jack knew this was their moment of reckoning. If they chose to ignore the truth, if they allowed Mr. Time to go unpunished, then Mr. Six's spirit would remain trapped, forever haunting the village that had failed him. At last, one of the elders, an old woman with wise, sorrowful eyes, stood up. She stepped forward, her gaze steady as she addressed the crowd. "If Jack is telling the truth, then we cannot ignore this," she said, her voice resolute. "We owe it to Mr. Six to uncover what really happened. We cannot allow a crime like this to go unanswered." The crowd shifted, a low murmur of agreement spreading through the villagers. Jack felt a swell of relief as he realized they were listening, that they were beginning to understand. He had done it. He had brought the truth into the light. As the elders began to discuss the next steps, Jack felt a strange sensation wash over him. The air around him seemed to lighten, the oppressive weight that had pressed on his chest for so long lifting, as if a burden had been removed. And then, in the corner of the room, just out of the corner of his eye, Jack thought he saw a figure faint, translucent, standing silently near the doorway. Mr. Six. The ghostly figure didn't speak, but Jack didn't need words to understand. There was a peace about him now, a sense of calm that hadn't been there before. Jack met the ghost's gaze, his heart pounding with the realization that the spirit had found closure. The truth was out, and justice was finally within reach. With a final, lingering glance, Mr. Six's ghost began to fade, dissolving into the light of the rising sun. Jack felt a tear slip down his cheek as he watched the figure disappear, leaving behind only the faintest trace of cold air. It was over. Mr. Six was at peace. But, for Jack, the events of the past few days would never truly be behind him. The horrors he had uncovered, the betrayal, the greed, the terrible weight of a man's life cut short would stay with him forever. He had exposed the truth, but the cost had been high, and the village would never be the same. As the villagers dispersed, still murmuring in shock and disbelief, Jack remained standing in the center of the hall, his thoughts racing. The sun had fully risen now, casting warm, golden light through the windows. The darkness was finally retreating, but Jack knew that it had left its mark on him, deep and indelible. Justice had been served. The ghost had been laid to rest, but the memories, those chilling, haunting memories, would remain. And Jack, for better or worse, would carry them with him for the rest of his life.